Hi, and welcome to a short review of the properties of soil. Keep in mind, this is just meant to wrap up where we've been and kind of pull some things together that we were unable to do since we haven't been at school. So the first property of soil that we looked at was soil texture. And just as a reminder, soil texture is the proportion of sand, silt, and clay in a soil sample. Sand is the biggest particle size, followed by silt, and clay is the smallest. So this picture may show that a little better. So they also include gravel. I think it's a little more familiar to you. But sand, biggest, silt's kind of in the middle, and clay is at the smaller end of things. So we did several activities to determine soil texture. You may remember we did the feel method. Most of you found your soil was kind of a loamy sand or a sandy loam, somewhere in there. So it was mostly sand, but a little bit of clay and silt was mixed in as well. Then the next day, if you remember, we did another soil texture lab with the sieves, and you put your soil sample in that you had collected from school. You shook it, and in the top sieve, you had the gravel, the next was the sand, and so on, and you used the scales to mass the amount of sand, silt, and clay, and you were able to use that to determine your soil texture. And if you remember, that required this triangle. So you found out the percent of clay in your sample, let's say it was 20. You found out the percent silt, let's say it was 20, and you figured out the percent of sand. And then if you remember, you drew the lines. I don't know if I can draw straight lines with this thing. I'll do my best. Boom, not so great, but hey. And where they intersected, identify, not the best circle, but identified your type of soil. And again, we had maybe a sandy loam here. Then the following day, we looked at the jars. If you remember, we put some of your soil sample in, added water, shook the heck out of it, and after a day or two, we measured the height of the soil column. Right? We measured the height of the whole column here. And then we measured just the height of the sand, just the height of the silts, just the height of the clay, and we were able to use that to determine percent of sand, silt, and clay. And again, we connected that to the triangle. So again, let's say we had 20% clay, 20% silt. That leaves us, if my math is correct, about 60% sand. And let's see if I can do any better. Connected our lines. All right. And that maybe put you in the sandy loam. And not everyone fell in the exact same texture classification, depending on exactly where you got your bouldered soil from. But hopefully that rings a bell. Sounds familiar. After we did the soil texture labs, we moved on to porosity. And if you remember, porosity is the amount of pore space, the open spaces between the particles. So the gravel or sand particles, they don't sit flat next to each other. There's some space between them. So, and you can see in this picture, but we've got some sand grains here, maybe some other decaying leaves, maybe, you've got some silt, but in between those, there's some empty space, right? That empty space could contain air or water, depending. So that porosity or pore space are those spaces between the particles that could contain air or potentially water. If you remember, we took a beaker and we filled it to 200 milliliter to that mark with gravel. You also did a beaker where you filled it with sand and a beaker with your soil from school. But I used the gravel, I thought it was the easiest to see. So we filled it to the 200 milliliter mark with the gravel. And then if you remember, you slowly added water. Right? You slowly added water. And the water started to fill up all the pore spaces. You may have even seen the air bubbling up as the water filled in those pore spaces. Right? And you filled it, you kept on adding water until like it just kind of reached the top and it couldn't take any more. Right? And then we used that to do some calculations. So let's say you were able to get 97 milliliters of water kind of into the gravel, into the spaces. If you added any more, if you added 98, 99, it would go way over the top of the gravel. So that kind of was like just as saturated as you could get it, 97 milliliters of water. So what that means is 97 milliliters out of the 200 milliliters, that was the total volume that you added the gravel, right? You filled it to 200 milliliters. That was our total volume. And if you got 97 milliliters of water into that, that meant that was filling up the empty spaces. So 97 milliliters divided by 200 is 0.485. And if I times that by 100, it converts it to a percent. So 48.5% is the porosity. Think about this, about half. If there was 200 milliliters, we filled that level with the rocks, and we were able to get in 100 milliliters, close to 97, pretty close to 100. That much water, that means about half of that space was empty space because we were able to get the water into it. So that was our pore space, roughly 48.5, so close to 50%. And this was some data that I took from somebody who did a gravel. They did kind of a finer sand and their soil. These are the porosities that they got. And so this upper number, this was always how much water they were able to fit in. So 97 milliliters of water into the gravel, 69 milliliters of water into the sand, and about 71 milliliters of water into their bullard soil. We always divided it by 200 because that was the total volume. We always filled the beaker to 200 milliliters with gravel. We filled another one, 200 milliliters with the sand, and 200 milliliters with our soil. So that was always our total volume. It was like how much water could we get into those empty spaces? And we always times by 100 to convert it to a percent. Right? Oops, yeah, I'm not so good at this thing. 100 and 100. So hopefully, again, that rings a bell. That sounds familiar. If not, send me a text through Remind or leave a comment and I can get back to you. I put this picture up. I thought it might be helpful to see that generally, this is just usually, there's always exceptions, but usually if you had, say, pure gravel, it's going to have the most pore spaces. And then as you get a little smaller, like let's say you had pure silt, you would have less pore spaces. And with clay, pure clay, you'd have the least. The reason is as the particles get smaller, they fit like a little more closely together, a little more tightly packed, a little nice and neater together, and that blocks the pathway for water, or I should say blocks the space. So you can kind of see like there's kind of a lot of space here, but as the particles get smaller, there's kind of like they fit so much nicer together. There's only these little teeny spaces in between them, and that's water. Pardon me, that's space where the water or air would fit. Okay? So as the particles get smaller in size, the spaces get smaller. It's a little more tightly packed. So that makes it a little more difficult for water and air to fit in there. And so our data, let me go back, kind of reflected that. I think in the gravel, we got about 48.5%, 50% pore space, and it started going down to about, I think with the fine sand, which was kind of in between the sand and the silt, we only had about 34% porosity. There was less pore spaces as the particles got smaller. Same deal. So again, any questions, shoot me a text through Remind or email me and I can get back to you as soon as possible. All right, the third lab we did was permeability, and this was towards the end. I think it was on the Thursday, Friday before we left. Maybe it was a little rushed, so check this one out. I did want to put a couple definitions. Infiltration is the ability of the water to penetrate the soil, to actually like get into it at the surface. Permeability is the ability of the water to actually like move through the sample, to make its way through the sample. I always talk about the ability of water to move through the sample, but it could also be air's ability to move through it as well. So infiltration, can the water get into the soil? Permeability, can it move through the soil once it gets in? Well, this was a nice picture, so kind of infiltration here. You can see the water, can it infiltrate the surface? If it can't, it's going to kind of build up at the top. If it can, it's going to get into the soil. So that's infiltration. Permeability is, can it actually move through it? So it's like, infiltration, can it just get into the top here and make its way in? Whereas permeability, once it gets in, can it find a path through the soil? But this is kind of a nice picture, same deal. So this would have like high infiltration, high permeability. Water and air can get in and move through the sample, whereas this would be a lower permeability and lower infiltration. It's a hard time getting in, hard time getting through. This was a nice demo. I'll leave it up for a sec. If you, a long one there, but if you go, I can even try to link it. If you go to this, it's actually, you click this little button and it'll actually be an active live little video. It's worth checking out. I still thought the picture was decent. You can see in gravel, the water gets in fairly easily, moves through pretty quickly, whereas as the particle sizes get smaller, right, we're going from biggest particle size to smallest. As they get smaller, it's harder for the water to get in, and then even harder for it to infiltrate. So as the particles get smaller, harder to infiltrate, has a harder time moving through the soil. This could be a problem for plants. You plant something here, well, this is going to drown your plants, even here. So that could be a problem. I put up our samples here. If you remember the gravel, when you poured the water in, if you remember, it like went boom, right away, went right through, had no problem infiltrating the gravel, went very quickly through the gravel, and very little water was held back. If not, all of the water came out. Okay. And we did the same thing with our Bullard soil, which is a little loamy, has some clay in it. Right? If you remember, we did have some clay and silt, which are kind of smaller particles. It had a harder time. It infiltrated, but once that water got in, it was kind of trapped in there, kind of stuck. It really slowed down. So it infiltrated all right, moderately, but then it kind of took some time to make its way through. And then once it was kind of saturated, it really slowed down quite a bit. And then the clay, this is a great example. This had quite a high amount of clay in it. And I let this sit for at least 4 hours and it looked like this. So you could see it really had a hard time infiltrating at all. So this was clay, which is a very fine particle, and the water just couldn't find a way in. It was just blocked. And once a little bit got in, it created quite a blockage, and it never really permeated this clay at all. It was basically stuck. So at the same time, we were looking at how much water went through the soil, but also how much it held back, how much it was able to retain. So water retention is like the water holding capacity of a soil, the amount of water it can hold when saturated, how much water does it hold on to. Sort of permeability is how well does the water move through the soil. Retention is how well does it hold on to that water. So again, we can look at our lab that we did. The gravel, water infiltrated, it went right through the soil, high permeability, right? Worked its way through very easily. So high permeability, gravel also has a lot of pore spaces that the water could kind of find a path through, right? But it didn't hold anything back. All the water drained out. So very little water was retained. So high porosity, lots of pore spaces. Water could move easily through it, found a path through the soil, through the gravel. But the fact is, all of it did get out, so none of it was held back. So very low water retention. And the loam, maybe somewhere in kind of the middle here, got in, a little bit of it drained, a little trouble infiltrating once it got saturated, but this was wet. When I cleaned out the tubes, it was muddy. This was wet, so it did hold back some. It didn't hold back all of the water because some drained out. It did hold back some. Somewhere in the middle. But the clay is a little tricky. The clay, the water really couldn't even infiltrate it. The permeability and infiltration was so low. None of it drained out because it just never made its way through. I would suspect if this water could get into the clay, it would be very waterlogged as well. It would stay in there. It would get stuck in there. So if you remember our results, I put here, I don't know if this is interesting, but sand and gravel, right, has a very low retention. The water just runs right through it. Whereas as you get a little more sand, silt, and then really clay, kind of clay here, silty clay, that would hang on to the water, hold on to it very tightly. So putting it together, I think the main thing to remember is, in general, we're keeping this very general. Oops. As the particle sizes get smaller, from gravel to clay, right, permeability goes down, infiltration goes down. So as the particle sizes get smaller, there's less pore spaces, the water and the air can't find a way through, so it blocks the water. So as you go from larger particle to smaller, permeability declines because there's less pore spaces, less open spaces for water to get through. But as you go from larger to smaller particle sizes, the retention usually increases. So silt and clay holds onto the water very tightly. It doesn't drain well. Instead, it retains it, holds onto it. Okay. So for farming, usually you want some organic matter, what we call humus. You want some cane leaves. You want some nutrients. Usually it's kind of a spongy-ness to it that allows water to infiltrate but not waterlog. You also would have some sand, silts, and clay. You usually want a mix of both, right? Organic and inorganic. And then a loam is usually what we're looking for if you're going to grow some plants. You want some sand that allows for drainage. You want silt that could kind of hang on to some water. And we'll talk about it tomorrow. Clay would help hold on to some nutrients. You want a little bit of both. You want to make sure you've got some porosity, not too much that would let all the water drain out, but you want some pore spaces so roots don't get rotten. They've got some air in there. You want soil that allows for infiltration and drainage, but doesn't become waterlogged, too waterlogged. I don't want that happy medium. You want water to drain so it doesn't get waterlogged, but you don't want all the water to run out. You want some water to be retained. So if you have sand, that allows for some pore spaces, that allows for some air to get in around roots, right? But if you've got, pardon me, a little silt and clay, that would make sure that not all the water runs out. You've got a little bit of tighter pore spaces that can hold on to some of that water without becoming waterlogged. So I found a site that had this and I thought it was nice. It says a loamy type of soil is generally considered the best type of soil for agriculture. It combines the best properties of sand, silt, and clay. It usually has good water drainage, but also retains some water. Good infiltration, but also allows for air and water to permeate. So that idea that you want some air spaces for roots so they don't get rotten and waterlogged, but you don't want to lose all of the water. You want a little bit of silt and clay to hold some water back. So tomorrow we'll talk a little more about soil fertility because you do need some silt and maybe some clay to hang on to nutrients. So that will be for tomorrow. So check out, I put some soil basic videos in the playlist that will help clarify in case I mumbled and my way through this. Check it out. There's a great one from the Bozeman AP Environmental Science site. Check it out, see what you think. Again, shoot me a text or an email if you have any questions. Thanks again, and I'll see you tomorrow.